So, very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first keynote lecture in the context of the workshop of our international research project, Twisted Transfers, Discursive Constructions of Corruption in Ancient Greece and Rome. I will shortly introduce our project and what it is all about before I get to introducing tonight's speaker, Professor Roland Kroeze from the Free University of Amsterdam. This is our first keynote lecture. Our project is a 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK and by the German Research Foundation, DFG, for the German part, within a program called the UK-German Collaborative Research in the Humanities. And this project has started running in this year 2020 and will be running in the first funding phase until 2023. You can see behind me, you can also move a bit, the logo of our project, which is an elaboration on a Greek vase by the so-called Mannheim painter, who painted it around the mid-5th century BCE and represents Polynices giving Eryphile the necklace of Harmonia, a very twisted gift that actually implies Eryphile going behind her husband's back and in the end causing his death. The project aim is indeed in a comparative fashion throughout antiquity, but also with the use of modern social models coming from social and political sciences to understand why and how forms of transfer could be and were presented in discourse as twisted and therefore as acts of corruption. We are very keen in our project also on doing a lot of activity in the field of impact and outreach. One part of this are these keynote lectures, which were from the very beginning conceived of for being recorded and then presented to a broader public. Little did we know in the beginning that we would all be online. We were considering recording in presence in a big room. And of course, we are very sad that we didn't have any chance to meet personally today, but that's how it works. And luckily, technology allows us to make this possible in any case. These keynote lectures, you can wait and look forward to the next ones over the next few years, are one part of our outreach program, which includes also, for instance, an episode in the BBC series Animated Thinking, which is already available online, and a further series of public lectures, which will happen over the next few years. So you can follow us. We have a homepage, which is based at the homepage of the University of Potsdam. We have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter page. You can follow us there. And there are also available already a presentation video, which explains you in a few minutes what is all about into this project, which is composed at the moment by 10 sub-projects. As I said, investigating different forms of discursive construction of corruption in Greco-Roman antiquity in different literary genres. With this, I'm very glad to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. And as I said, I'm very sad that we didn't have a chance of meeting in person and having a more social kind of event. As Professor Roland Kroeze, as I said, from the Free University of Amsterdam, is one of the most important and most renowned scholars of corruption from a historical perspective. He is currently Associate Professor of History and Director of Studies at his institution. He obtained his PhD in 2013 with a work on corruption and public morality in Dutch politics between 1848 and 1940. This was embedded into a bigger project called the Genesis of Public Value Systems, 1650 to 1950, funded by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, NWO. And his PhD dissertation was then published in the same year, 2013, as a monograph. I read the English title and not the Dutch title of the book, A Question of Political Morality, Political Corruption Scandals, and Good Government in the Netherlands, 1848 to 1940. After that, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam from 2014 until 2017. And in this phase, he was involved in a big project funded by the European Union within the 7th framework project. The name of the project was Anti-Corp, and it was a project completely dedicated to the history of anti-corruption. And the main product of this project was, or is, a big collective volume he edited together with Guy Geltner and Andre Vittoria, called A History of Anti-Corruption from Antiquity Until the Modern Era, which was published in 2018. Since 2019, he coordinates a research project with the title Colonial Normativity, Corruption and Difference in Colonial and Post-Colonial Histories of Empire and Nation, but is funded again by the NWO and investigates the role of corruption in Dutch and Indonesian history, in particular in reference to state formation and economic development in the 19th, 20th, and also in the beginning of the 21st century. Roland Kroeze has an extremely international career. I now mentioned his main projects in Amsterdam, but he has been a visiting scholar in Oxford, at Corpus Christi College, in Avignon, at the Centre Norbert Elias, at the University of Warwick, at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He is a member of the advisory board of the Amsterdam Center for Political Thought. He is a co-founder and member of the international scientific network Politics and Corruption, History and Sociology, which is funded by the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris, together with many other European research institutions. And he's extremely engaged in outreach and impact. He has delivered already a lot of content to media and societal organizations on corruption, integrity, and the history of these two concepts, and also on Dutch politics. Dear Ronald, we're very happy that you accepted our invitation to be our first keynote speaker, and we are very excited about your lecture tonight with the title, The Presence of a Past Problem, Corruption in Historical Perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very kind introduction. So I will focus on corruption, construction of corruption in from an historical perspective, and I will refer to some of the projects I've been involved in. So that's why the examples I will use. Of course, I will also refer to other projects, and at the end, I'm also open to questions and debate. In the last decades, corruption has received new public and scholarly attention in the West. As a reason, many have mentioned the role of contemporary developments, such as that the end of the Cold War made that the corruption of certain allied regimes needed no longer to be silenced for reasons of geopolitical concern or political stability. See, for example, the diminishing support from the West that contributed to the fall of President Mobutu of Congo in 1997 and of President Suharto of Indonesia in 1998, who are both considered among the most corrupt politicians in recent history, according to rankings from Transparency International and other organizations. Secondly, globalization of trade and free market ideology made corruption more expensive and less easy to justify. Thirdly, in recent years, international organizations such as Transparency International and the World Bank addressed the disadvantages of corruption and put anti-corruption on the agenda. How true this might be, recent historical work has stressed the importance of taking long-term developments into consideration as well, if one wants to understand the rediscovery of corruption and the challenges surrounding it. Debates on corruption and anti-corruption date back to classical times, as can be derived from the work of Greek thinkers such as Aristotle and Roman thinkers such as Cicero. And the project, of course, many of you are involved in, is another example of research into this specific period. Their work was rediscovered as a source of inspiration in late medieval and early modern period by Republican thinkers such as Machiavelli. These authors, when debating corruption, condemned the bribery of magistrates and misuses of public office by rulers. In their opinion, corruption was something negative, which they linked to individual misbehavior as well as to moral decay of an entire society. Until today, examples can be found in which corruption is understood accordingly. However, the early modern period was also characterized by the existence of ideas that were more dominant than they are today. Firstly, the idea that corruption was the result of the loss of virtue or moral dedication to serve the res publica, or general interest. In other words, individuals and communities too eager to pursue their private interests on behalf of the general interest were lambasted for corruption. Secondly, in the early modern period, a cyclical understanding of corruption prevailed. It was humans' destiny that individuals and societies, after a period of growth, would degenerate and pervert into a rotten form, such as a monarchy that protected the general well-being into a tyranny that protected only the interests of the tyrant and his allies, or aristocracy serving the republic's interest turning into an oligarchy ruled by a self-interested and decadent elite. In such a view, anti-corruption was a shared moral responsibility of citizens and politicians and political commentators, dedicated to the well-being of their society. They had to be humble and virtuous, as well as be alert to signs of degeneration and to take appropriate measures to prevent further perversion, for example, by appointing new virtuous rulers. However, the understanding of corruption did substantially change during what we might call the long 19th century, or the era of the birth of the modern world, as a result of ideological changes and political reforms brought by the Enlightenment, the Atlantic revolutions of around 1800, and the reactions these developments provoked in the decades thereafter. Corruption played a pivotal role in public discourse in this period, as can be derived from recent historical research on corruption, which several historians have been involved in. Among them also Jens Ivo Engels from Germany, Frédéric Monnier from France, to name but a few of them. In the era of revolutionary reform in the decades around 1800, in many Western countries, politicians rose to power on an anti-corruption agenda. The French radical revolutionary leader Robespierre was nicknamed the Incorruptible and confident to eliminate all old perverted ideas and corrupt practices. And although Robespierre would be executed and his ideas were often deemed too radical, the 19th century saw many politicians seeking power by making use of anti-corruption campaigns against examples of ancien regime corruption in their respective countries. Moreover, applauding the skills and merits of the individual in this period had its consequences. The best should rule and not those who received their position because of family background and traditional privilege. And although Republican thinking, with its emphasis on civic virtue, made a revival in the decades around 1800, it was often combined or adjusted in word and deed with what we could call a liberal understanding of corruption, at least in several Western European countries. That the promotion of self-interest was no longer unvirtuous, but something natural and a form of anti-corruption in itself. In a world of free trade and laissez-faire that gave room to private entrepreneurship, individuals would and could pursue their own interests. And this would, by an invisible hand, the famous invisible hand, Smith, contribute to overall well-being and not corruption. In the same tradition, mercantilism and government-consented trade monopolies became figureheads of corruption. Hence, the Dutch revolutionaries of around 1800, to take this example, attacked the Dutch stadtholder of the House of Orange and its ruling representatives, the regenten, the regents, for their privileges, a system of patronage, to divide among themselves and their families' administrative positions, and to allow for tax farming and the sale of offices. Moreover, the revolutionaries, like in England and France, demanded the termination of state-supported trade monopolies, such as the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. the symbol of corruption and degeneration of the once so powerful Dutch Republic. This critique was combined with pleas for a radical democratic change of society and political structures. Hence, in 1795, with French support, the old Dutch Republic was overthrown and replaced by the so-called Batavian Republic. The stadtholder of the House of Orange fled to England, the VOC was terminated, and a new democratic constitution was adopted in 1798. This constitution strengthened the centrality of power, so the process of the formation of a nation-state, abolished elites' privileges, including the sale of offices, and sharpened the separation of public and private, of politics and religion, and of state and economy, as means to end corruption. The Batavian Republic proved unstable and was replaced, first by a French satellite state and after Napoleon's defeat in 1813-1815 by the Kingdom of the Netherlands. But throughout the 1830s and 1840s, like elsewhere in Europe, reform-minded politicians kept asking for change, which some of them were able to realize during the revolutionary years of 1830 and 1848, famous years of revolution in European history. In 1848, the leader of Dutch liberals, Johan Thorbecke, wrote and implemented a new constitution in the Netherlands. He criticized the pre-1848 government structures and held the elites responsible for corruption. Clearly, he had studied the Ancien Regime and the French Revolution and argued that, and I'm quoting him now, the French turnover was especially a struggle against the system to keep public rights in private ownership. End of quote. He also criticized the King Willem I for mixing up public and private, or in the words of Thorbecke, and I'm quoting him again, the state has at one time been compared with a family. William I, at the head of the country of his fathers, seems to have taken this comparison seriously, while left to him the government as if it were his private household. End of quotation. If we zoom out, we see how the understanding of corruption changed in the modern era. First, because elite privileges such as patronage and the misuse of public power for private interest were regarded the main types of corruption, corruption became predominantly defined as the misuse of public power for private gain. This meant by now that not so much a lack of civic virtue or the unlimited promotion of one's private interest was the real cause of bad government and degeneration, but the merger of public and private. Moreover, for public officials, serving the public interest became an absolute requirement. No longer were public officials legitimately entitled to also serve their faction and family interests, as had been the case during the Ancien Regime. Additionally, what was considered the public interest became equal to the state interest. Hence, corruption was the misuse of state office or the state's interest. A second major change that occurred, besides that corruption became understood as the misuse of public power for private gain, was that due to the emphasis on progress since the Enlightenment, the belief rose that a radical change and the implementation of a new formal legal structure could eliminate systemic corruption. Hence, this led to the introduction of constitutional frameworks in which the public and the private were formally separated, as well as specific laws against bribery and formal bureaucratic standards that put a ban on gifts, nepotism, and cronyism. Legal measures to allow for more private freedom in the sphere of the economy is to be considered as part of the same development. Third, in the modern era, serious corruption became, as it still is, no longer understood as something cyclical or unavoidable, but as an historical phenomenon, a thing of the past. There could be done something about corruption, but this required a break from the past, from the Ancien Regime with its patronage, nepotism, and the mixing of public and private tasks. Throughout the 19th century and even beyond, anti-corruption concentrated on eliminating what were called ancien regime practices, or old corruption, as it was called in the 19th century Britain. Once successfully eliminated, a society would enter the final stage of human development and become a corruption-free modern country. If we look at the Dutch example, one can see how slowly but steadily this change took place and how public intellectuals, including historians, were involved in it. During the revolutionary period, a distinction was envisioned between an historical corrupt system of privilege, patronage and misuse of public office, the Dutch Republic, the Dutch Ancien Regime, and a new type of government in the future that would be without corruption. At the same time, the modern distinction between a current past, a present of anti-corruption reform, and a corruption-free future were not yet firmly established. For example, the patriots, the Dutch reformers of the 1780s, were still longing for what they called the restoration of old republican freedoms and rights to end the corruption of their time. That was in the 1780s. And the elite who founded the Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1814 gave the throne to King William I, who claimed to restore the link with the past that had been broken by the Dutch Revolution of 1795 that had led to the establishment of the Batavian Republic. Not surprisingly, some form of restoration of old practices and privileges was important to the king, as it was to most European monarchs in the era of restoration, the decades after the fall of Napoleon. Having said this, ideas of modern centralized government and social engineering, especially the idea that an actively interfering government could bring progress, was part of the ideal of good governance of many restoration kings. But the Dutch liberals of 1848 held a different view on the past, which contributed to a process of historicizing corruption. Thorbecke contrasted his systemic critique on William I with his own current and future reform program. Although Thorbecke had intensively studied the revolutionary changes of around 1800, he did not frame the liberal reform agenda as a return to the past. When in the decades after 1848 in the Netherlands, the reformed constitution was not altered by a counter-revolution, as was the case in several German states and in France, where the 1848 revolution was a failure, or partly, Dutch liberals began to perceive, understand, and present 1848 as an historical turning point. Liberal-minded scholars, including historians, contributed greatly to the narrative of a Netherlands of before and after 1848, with the concept of corruption playing a crucial role in this narrative. The founder of modern professional history writing in the Netherlands, the liberal historian Robert Vrijing, the Dutch Ranke, paid ample attention to the corrupt practices of the time of the Dutch Republic. His vision on the Dutch past informed later generations. In 1913, in a book celebrating the centennial of the Dutch Kingdom, the historian Chris de Lintem wrote, referring to the words of Vrijing, that because of the liberal reform of 1848, and I'm now quoting him, the corruption of past times had vanished. End of quote. This claim was restated by the famous Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, a specialist on medieval history, who argued in 1934 that serious corruption in the Netherlands had become impossible because of a high standard of public honesty. Itself, according to him, an element of the Dutch burgerlijke cultuur, the bourgeois civil culture that had reached maturity during the 19th century. End of quote. Here we see how the Dutch equivalent of what in British historiography is called old corruption had also entered Dutch political history and history writing. The lasting consequences of this interpretation should not be underestimated, I think, because it was related to a fourth development of othering. If the past is a foreign country, which is a famous quote, we all know, and corruption is a remnant of the past, serious corruption was no longer to be found in the modern Netherlands. Instead, it belonged to the world of pre-modern and traditional societies, in short, the other. At first, in Dutch discourse, in other European discourses of this period, the other was Britain or France, so a foreign country, with their histories of electoral corruption, Britain, and systemic elite privilege, especially France. From the end of the 19th century, whenever corruption was debated, so-called Eastern empires, the Russian, the Austrian, and the Ottoman Empire, were taken as an example. Sometimes the other was closer at home. In many European countries, scandals and debates on corruption in the 19th and 20th centuries illustrate that minorities, especially Catholics, and also Jews, in countries where there was a Protestant majority, were at best untrustworthy and at worst held directly responsible for every form of corruption. And finally, an important other were the indigenous cultures and pre-modern practices that persisted in the colonies of European countries, according to contemporaries. The new project I am coordinating, which was briefly mentioned, is exactly about this topic. I and other historians at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, together with historians from the University of Yogyakarta in Indonesia, investigate the history of corruption as a normative framework to create, maintain and challenge exclusive power structures in colonial and post-colonial processes of state formation. We analyze intersecting moments of entanglement around 1900, for example. We analyze corruption debate about concessions, for example, the Biliton scandal, which was about the illegal granting of a concession to delve tin ore, the island of Biliton, which took place in an era of civilizing missions and late colonial state formation. Another sub-project concentrates on 1945, the era of independence movements, in which anti-colonial nationalists turned against the corruption of colonialism. A third project focuses on the relationship between authoritarian government and the dictatorship of Suharto and the conditional norms of development aid during the 1970s and 1980s. And the last project is about the post-1990 era of transnational corruption indices with their imbalance in grading between North and South, or former colonizing and former colonized countries. What is the impact of corruption understandings with their background in modernization discourse, in terms of governance? What is the weight of the past and which past to understand the history of corruption and good governance up until today? These are some of the questions we try to answer. Linking discourse to politics and different periods is crucial to better understand the history of corruption. Our Dutch Indonesia project is, like other projects on the history of corruption that use a long-term approach, of importance, we think, because of the fact that understandings of corruption that were developed in the long 19th century continue to dominate in the 20th century and beyond, and also outside the Western world. In the Western Hemisphere, after the Second World War, becoming a modern corruption-free state was equal to becoming a liberal democracy with a market economy. Modernization theories of the 1950s and 1960s strengthened the tendency to think in terms of developmental stages and the assumption that processes of development followed a certain progression, which merely allowed for temporary relapse, as Thomas Mergel once summarized. Moreover, modernization theories, and again I'm quoting him, could also be read as a reaction to the process of decolonization underway at the time. It expected the countries of the Third World to catch up and become developing countries, to evolve along the path of European, North American modernity. In this sense, and I'm still quoting Thomas Mergel, they were never merely analytical instruments, but also suggestions from political consultants. End of quote. In these theories, the concept of corruption played a structuring role. For example, if we look at 1961, a co-authored book on corruption written by the Dutch sociologist Wertheim, a former colonial civil servant who was a professor of Southeast Asia studies thereafter. Although there had been problems, he and his co-author he and his co-author regarded serious corruption in the Western world to be resolved and to be found in the non-European world. Their work was very much inspired by Weber's typology. Countries in the West and in Asia received the label transitional, in transition, overgang, or modern. Wertheim even concluded that already back in the colonial period, Western standards were half-heartedly obeyed in the colony, suggesting a link between the period before and after colonization to understand post-colonial corruption. Based on the level of corruption and the efforts to overcome this, he portrayed many countries, including Indonesia, as semi-traditional societies that were still in transition. Corruption was an important analytical tool for modernization theory. In 1968, Samuel Huntington stated, and I'm quoting him, "The difference in the level of corruption which may exist between modernized and the political developed societies of the Atlantic world and those of Latin America, Africa, and Asia in large part reflect their differences in political modernization and political development. Countries in," end of quote, "countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia still experience corruption because they were not completely modern yet, as their political and economic system was characterized by clientelism and patronage." So in fact, ancien regime corruption. However, there were signs of change. In fact, corruption was, and I'm quoting Huntington again, "most prevalent during the most intense phase of modernization," end of quote. Part of this understanding was that anti-corruption was not explicitly searched for. In the 1950s and 1960s, no global initiatives were taken to establish anti-corruption policies explicitly. Explicit anti-corruption campaigns even met with skepticism. A fanatical, and I'm quoting Huntington again, "a fanatical anti-corruption mentality has ultimate effects similar to those of corruption itself. It undermines the autonomy of politics," end of quote. But things would change. In the 1970s, a new series of corruption scandals broke out in Western countries. In 1972, the American Watergate scandal showed the existence of practices in Western governments up to the top level that were labeled as corruption. Misuse of public power for political gain, the covering up of evidence for reasons of party politics, the bribing of politicians, and a lack of transparency to protect President Richard Nixon at the time from being prosecuted for corruption. In the wake of the Watergate investigations, it was discovered that many American companies had made illegal payments to public officials. The evolving Lockheed scandal of the mid-1970s was about a series of bribes of foreign officials by Lockheed to promote the purchase of their aircrafts. After the investigations, many high-ranking officials had to resign. In the Netherlands, famously, Prince Bernhard, the husband of Queen Juliana, had to lay down his official tasks. He was an Inspector General for the Dutch Army. In Japan, Prime Minister Tanaka was arrested and convicted. In Italy, President Leone had to resign, and in Germany, Sweden, and Turkey, fierce accusations were made against officials. Germany against Minister Strauss. As a direct response to Lockheed, in the United States, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, was implemented in 1977. It criminalized the bribing of foreign officials by US companies and citizens. It was the first law of its kind. As American companies feared the disadvantages of this law, they urged the government to establish a global level playing field. With American support, corruption and anti-corruption were put on the agenda of the OECD and the United Nations. The second half of the 1970s, the UN General Assembly accepted a resolution which called for cooperation against international corruption and bribery in international business transactions. For developing countries, it offered an opportunity to criticize Western involvement in their countries under the banner of development aid programs that in reality brought corruption. Because new corruption scandals saw light, the subject of corruption stayed on the agenda in the 1980s and 1990s. In the 1980s, West German politics was shocked by the Flick affair. A parliamentary investigation showed that, among other issues, party officials of the leading German parties had accepted illegal gifts from the German company Flick. In the early 1990s, Italy was shocked by the Mani Puliti investigations that revealed how Italian politicians had illegally provided public contracts to entrepreneurs in return for money and power. Great Britain had also had its scandals, among others the Homes for Vote scandal, which was about conservative governors using public resources to change the social compilation of voting districts to create better chances to win the next elections. Outside Europe, corruption scandals that involved men such as Marcos in the Philippines, Mobutu in Congo, Suharto in Indonesia, caused public indignation there, as well as in Western countries, as these leaders were considered political friends and had received large sums of Western aid over the years. While the scandals kept corruption on the agenda, the end of the Cold War established a Washington consensus among influential countries and international organizations. By now, corruption was understood as a form of rent-seeking or misuse of public good by self-interested individuals who decided their actions on a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, the absence of penalty. Opportunities for corruption were thus created by the denial of this self-interest, like in communist countries, and by a lack of structures and values to link private interest with public well-being. In other words, privatization of state bureaucracies, monopolizing public goods was needed, as well as a clearer and stricter set of anti-corruption laws to combat the extremes, especially bribery. Global civil society organizations such as Transparency International, founded in 1993, also contributed to the growing awareness for corruption and this specific interpretation of corruption in this era. The new consensus thus promoted the criminalization of bribery. In 1996, the UN Declaration Against Corruption and Bribery in International Commercial Transactions finally passed. In 1997, the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Officials was adopted and went into effect in 1999. The IMF and the World Bank took corruption more seriously as well in this period. 1996, World Bank Director James Wolvenson described corruption as a, and I'm quoting, cancer. The change of international organizations was considered a breakthrough. European organizations followed. Several European firms such as Siemens, Daimler, Bosch, Philips supported the change, and the individual member countries reformed their judicial system. In Germany, bribery in business transactions within Germany was prohibited in 1997. Bribery of foreign officials was no longer tax deductible after 1999. So before 1999 it was tax deductible. And bribing representatives of foreign private firms was criminalized in 2002. However, the so-called consensus did not prevent the rise of unease, for new scandals were discovered every year. And it also involved well-known European countries like Siemens that had bribed officials and had to pay an $800 million fine in 2008, the highest fine in the history of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Besides these new corruption scandals and the end of the Cold War, anti-corruption programs, developmental aid programs, explicitly based on modernization theories, met with more skepticism, as explained. And by the 1980s, corruption, patronage, clientelism, bribery was diagnosed as endemic in many African and Asian countries. Already back in 1986, Jean-François Ménard, in a study on corruption in Africa, wrote, "It is corruption which is normal and the absence of corruption which is abnormal." End of quote. The rise of post-colonial views further contributed to a critical stance to existing dominating views on corruption and anti-corruption. What was called by some the anti-corruption industry had severely damaged the possibilities of poor countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia to develop on their own terms, so it was argued. And the Washington Consensus contributed to that process. Even the corruption rankings, such as those published by Transparency International, the yearly Corruption Perception Index, that portray most countries of the global south as too roughly corrupt, had undermined trust in local government and frightened foreign investors. Moreover, Western aid programs that provided economic assistance under the conditions that Western-style governance codes were implemented were blamed for neocolonialism by some. Countries have to adjust to Western standards, while these policies are very beneficial for those who already meet the conditions, e.a. Western countries and companies. The rise of big scandals in Western countries, the ones I just mentioned, also undermined the established narrative. And when Germany experienced severe corruption scandals in the last 2 decades that involved individuals and companies of high standing, such as former Prime Minister Helmut Kohl, the CDU Spendenaffaire in the late 1990s, and Siemens and Volkswagen, just mentioned, the sociologist Dirk Tensler even concluded, and I'm quoting him, "The Germans did long perceive themselves as citizens of a modern country. And that, of course, also means that corruption is not a problem or issue in Germany. Corruption is regarded as un-German and as incompatible with the cultural self-image of decent and responsible citizens. However, the recent corruption scandals have revealed the German myth of a corruption-free modern country." End of quote. The turn towards good governance in the last decades, which includes a broader definition of corruption and what it is and where it can be found, as well as a more modest understanding of what anti-corruption programs can establish in the short run, are not the final solution to overcome this problem. And although it was also an historic turn in a way, it is not that the work of historians and the ambivalences of the past are always included in these recent good governance studies. In a 2002 report written by the social scientists and policy advisors Land Pritchett and Michael Woolcock, at the time working for the World Bank, getting to Denmark, according to many rankings at the time and still the least corrupt country in the world, was addressed as a policy research question. This was soon rephrased as how to get to Denmark or becoming Denmark by, among others, Francis Fukuyama and Alina Munjo-Pipidi, a well-known anti-corruption scholar and policy advisor. Yet these studies brought back in a longer history of fighting corruption, but are often also a bit one-sided and sometimes even teleological, as institutions are studied that are emblematic for countries that are today ranked among the least corrupt in the world. In a recent volume on anti-corruption that includes contributions from 20 historians and covers ancient, early modern and modern history, it was mentioned briefly during the introduction, we have, I and together with many colleagues, shown that analysis of past examples of anti-corruption, also from countries and cultures that have a very corrupt image, such as the decadent Roman Empire or the French and Dutch ancien regimes, can provide fruitful insights for understanding corruption and anti-corruption today. Let me come to a conclusion. Definitions of corruption and anti-corruption should always be understood in their ideological, political, and historical context. In fact, we cannot statistically prove if the increase of corruption in a certain period had anything to do with the rise of corruption itself, nor that anti-corruption measures were ineffective and that is the reason why there is so much talking about corruption in a certain period. In other words, the recent attention towards corruption inside and outside the academia could be better understood as a reconsideration of the legitimacy and origins of the modern understanding and discursive construction of corruption, in a response to changing political and economic circumstances on a national and global level. Moreover, reconsidering the history of corruption, which include reconsidering the history of corruption of the ancient, medieval and early modern era, can bring back in the paradoxes and ambiguities of recurrent anti-corruption programs. For the modern period, the introduction of democracy, liberal market economy or liberal bureaucracy, so that what is often received and perceived as the core of the successful politics of modernization and anti-corruption in Western countries, was also a paradoxical process itself. To put it differently, it was a history in which certain forms of corruption were eliminated. For example, the sale of offices, tax farming, and, as a key idea, the legitimate use of a public office for private, family, or factional interests. Then again, it is definitely also a history of new types of corruption, as well as the reoccurrence of past corruption, electoral fraud, bureaucratic corruption, lobbying with the purpose to serve private interests, the privilege of tax evasion for those who can afford the necessary legal structures, and the misuse of public office of leading officials in Western countries for family gain. Therefore, taking the modern narrative for granted, thus the idea that corruption is a past problem, that real corruption is to be found in other places because it is solved here, is one-sided for both scientific and societal reasons. But this is not a story of pessimism, I think, but a call to take a different look in further research on corruption and good governance. That includes, firstly, to reconsider established notions of the existence of a public-private divide and their consequences from a long-term historical perspective, including researching the history behind constructions of corruption. Secondly, to study corruption from an entangled and global history perspective, or to include that perspective as well, with a focus on the relational character of corruption. For example, by paying attention to how the idea of colonial corruption or the corrupt colony was the result of imperial structures of difference, of creating difference between a center and a periphery. Or how examples of bribery in the global south are also part of local as well as global circumstances, and not only of local circumstances. Thirdly, to pay much more attention to the link between ideology and policy in history. To put it differently, if corruption is the bad or deviated form from something that was originally good and pure, it means that corruption can never be understood without paying attention to the construction and role that ideals of good governance, so of what is pure and good, and the ideal form of politics and how society should be organized. Fourth, from an applied history perspective, one could argue, so for policy purposes, we should make much more use of corruption debates in the public domain. And don't hesitate to draw lines between the past and the present. They point at the misunderstandings or failure of ideals and constructions of good governance in political reality. And scandals and debates about corruption make explicit how the public defines the public good or proper public behavior and the proper use of public resources at a certain moment in time, including all the contradictions. It's not to say that the public has just one voice, but it makes explicit the conflicting and contradicting ideas about proper public behavior. So in short, and I'm now coming to an end, this is a call to continue new historical research into corruption and anti-corruption, including reinterpreting established notions as well as analyzing corruption and anti-corruption in historical cultures that may seem less evident to study and to learn from, including executing studies of corruption in the ancient world and other pre-modern societies, as well as looking at the entangled character of corruption, which include looking at the local and global and how different regions of the world interact. Like the question of corruption and good governance is never to be solved, so is its history never finished. Thank you for your attention.